Have you ever wondered why the Bible begins with the phrase, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," and why, right after, the text plunges into darkness, chaos, and deep waters? Something doesn't seem complete. Could the true beginning of creation be missing? You're about to hear a revelation that has been hidden for millennia and that could change your understanding of Genesis forever. Watch until the end and draw your own conclusions. If you feel like there's something missing in the story of creation, this video is for you. Like it, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. Because what we're about to reveal could change everything you thought you knew about Genesis. Share it with someone who loves discovering the mysteries of the Word. And get ready to see the beginning like never before. There are ancient accounts that suggest that an entire chapter was removed from the book of Genesis, an introduction that would have come before "Let there be light." A seeming divine preamble that recounted spiritual events that preceded everything else. But why would this section have been removed? And more importantly, who decided to hide this alternative beginning? Many scholars and rabbis throughout the centuries believed that the elders of Israel themselves suppressed these writings because they were too dangerous. Now, think about it. Why would God begin the Bible in the midst of chaos? The earth was formless and empty and covered in darkness. Doesn't it seem strange that the Creator would begin everything this way? This raised suspicions among early scholars. Where is the description of before the chaos? What was there before the earth? The silence of Scripture about this period is so profound that many have come to believe that the answer was deliberately removed. And we're not talking about modern theories. Even in ancient Jewish writings, in Kabbalistic texts, and in books like the Zohar, there are clear clues that there was a previous narrative, a sort of chapter 0, recorded and then hidden. It spoke of a rebellion, of beings of light, and of an eternal covenant, all before the creation of physical light. If this is true, then Genesis as we know it is just a restart. But what happened before? Among scholars of Jewish tradition, there are references to books mentioned in the Bible itself but which are no longer in it: the Book of the Wars of the Lord, the Book of the Righteous, and other lost scrolls reveal that not everything was preserved. But most disturbingly, according to some ancient rabbis, there was a text that came before Genesis 1. 1 and which was removed by order of the elders of Israel themselves. They believed that the people were not ready to know certain spiritual truths. The reason? This content exposed a spiritual dimension that predated our world. It described a time when God was not alone. Other beings were present with him, spiritual creatures who also witnessed the formation of the heavens and the earth. Some of these beings would have transgressed even before the material creation. Chapter 0, as some call it, detailed this hidden rebellion, and it was considered so shocking that ancient leaders decided to hide it to preserve order and avoid heresy. This silence was maintained for centuries, but fragments have survived. Texts such as the Sefer Harazim, the Book of Enoch, and even the first chapters of the Zohar allude to an earlier spiritual creation. They mention beings formed of fire and light, called primordials, who were neither angels nor men. They say that they inhabited a celestial sphere called Or-Kadmon, the primordial light, and that something tragic happened there, something that forced God to erase that entire reality. And it is this very event that many believe has been removed from Genesis, because if readers knew that there was a fall before the fall, a creation before the creation, the entire traditional theological framework would collapse. The question then arises, what happened to these beings, and why was the Spirit of God hovering over the waters? As if surveying the remains of an ancient catastrophe? Most people believe that the Bible begins with a simple narrative: God created the world, formed man, placed him in Eden, and everything proceeded from there. But if we look closely, we realize that right after Genesis 1 verse 1, something strange happens. The sacred text says that God created the heavens and the earth. And then it states that the earth was formless and empty. That does not seem natural. Why would a divine creation begin like this, immersed in disorder and darkness? Was the earth in that state from the very beginning? Or did something occur between one verse and the next? This apparent silence between Genesis 1 verse 1 and 1 may second hide one of the greatest mysteries of the Bible. Let's analyze it more deeply. The phrase, "the earth was formless and empty," may seem simple. But it carries a much deeper meaning in the original Hebrew. The words used there are tohu v'bohu, which indicates something chaotic, desolate, as if it had been destroyed. In other words, we are not talking about raw matter being shaped, but about something that had already been ruined. The idea that God would create something in a state of chaos defies the logic of divine perfection. This has led many scholars to conclude that this chaos was not the beginning of creation but rather the result of a previous destruction. Something happened. And it was so impactful that it left the earth unrecognizable. We call this idea the gap theory. This theory suggests that there was a pre-Adamic era. A period not described in detail in the scriptures but suggested by them. In this interval before Adam and Eve, the planet already existed. Perhaps inhabited by spiritual beings or even by some unknown form of life. But something occurred, a rebellion, a judgment, or a cosmic event of great proportions. And this creation was devastated. What we see in Genesis 1 verse 2 would then be the result of a ruined world about to be restored by God. The creation of Adam in this context would be a new phase, not the absolute beginning of everything. The Bible itself gives us hints that something grand occurred before the creation of man. In Job 38, God questions Job, saying, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me. If you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know." Here we see that there were conscious beings, the so-called sons of God, already present during the foundation of the earth. This means that a previous heavenly order already existed, accompanying the formation of the physical world. These sons of God are often interpreted as angels or celestial beings. If they were present before the creation of Adam, what were they doing there? What was their purpose? And why has this earlier reality been forgotten? To better understand this mystery, we must also consider what the Bible says about Lucifer's fall. In Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, we find descriptions of an exalted celestial being, full of wisdom and splendor, who rebelled against God out of pride. He is called the morning star, and he proclaims in his heart, "I will ascend to heaven, I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will be like the Most High." This rebellion is not treated as something that occurred after the creation of man, but rather in a time before. This reinforces the idea that there was an active spiritual reality before Eden and that this rebellion had profound consequences on the cosmos, including the earth. If this fall occurred before Genesis 1 verse 2, it is possible that the chaotic state of the earth is precisely the reflection of that event. God's judgment on Lucifer's rebellion would have resulted in destruction so intense that the earth was thrown into disorder, becoming formless and empty, covered by darkness. This would explain why the creation we see from verse 3 onward seems more like a restoration than an original creation. God was not starting from scratch but rather putting order into what had been corrupted. This reading completely changes the way we understand the beginning of the Bible and reveals that there is much more happening behind the scenes than one might imagine. The phrase, "Let there be light," would not then be the beginning of creation per se, but the start of the reconstruction of a shaken world. This aligns with the nature of God to restore, redeem, and transform what has been damaged. It is interesting to note that the sun, the moon, and the stars are only mentioned on the fourth day. So what was that light at the beginning? Many believe it was the light of the divine presence emerging over a dark and fragmented world. The light did not come only to illuminate but to declare, God's plan is not over. Even after the destruction, he was ready to start anew. This teaches us something profound about the character of the Creator. There are also indications outside the Bible that support this theory. Archaeological discoveries, inexplicable megalithic structures, fossils of creatures that do not fit the post-Adamic narrative. All this feeds the possibility that there was a pre-human era. Unknown and mysterious. Some scholars suggest that science and faith are not in conflict, but that science may be detecting the remnants of this previous creation. What we call ancient mysteries may be merely fragments of a world that existed between the first two verses of the Bible and that was wiped away, or rather, judged, before the new beginning with Adam. This understanding also clarifies why the enemy appears active right in the first chapters of Genesis. In Genesis 3, we see the serpent deceiving Eve in the garden. But where did it come from? When did it fall? Why is it already there, operating with such cunning? If Lucifer's fall had occurred after the creation of man, it would require a very short interval of time for such corruption to take place. But if the celestial rebellion happened before the creation of Adam, as the gap theory proposes, then everything makes sense. The serpent was already an ancient enemy, experienced, and its plan was already underway long before humanity existed. There is also a curious detail in the Hebrew of Genesis 1 verse 2. The term translated as darkness is choshek, which does not merely mean the absence of light, but deep, dense, spiritual darkness. In several biblical passages, this word is associated with judgment, with the presence of evil, with a separation from the glory of God. This leads us to understand that the darkness mentioned in that verse was not only physical, it was spiritual. The planet was not only dark, it was spiritually contaminated. And once again, this suggests that something of cosmic proportions had occurred. Creation did not begin in light, it began in ruins. Throughout the scriptures, God always acts in a restorative manner. When Israel falls, he sends prophets. When the temple is destroyed, he announces its rebuilding. When humanity strays, he offers redemption. This shows that God's nature is to begin again where there has been ruin. Genesis 1 verse 3 can be read from this perspective, and God said, "Let there be light," as a decree of restoration. A proclamation of hope over a wounded world. This perspective completely changes the tone of the narrative. It is not just a poetic description of creation. It is the announcement of the divine plan coming into action once more, following a primordial fall. And here is the most intriguing part: if there was a previous creation, who was part of it? Who inhabited the earth before man? Some suggest that they were merely spiritual beings. Others, more daring, speak of a pre-Adamic race. Perhaps linked to the sons of God mentioned in various biblical passages. There are even those who believe that the famous giants of Genesis 6 verse 4, called the Nephilim, are descendants of beings from that earlier era. These are theories, yes, but all based on biblical texts and patterns, and all point to one reality. There are more mysteries in the heavens and on earth than our theology usually admits. One point that cannot be ignored is the connection between the deep mentioned in Genesis 1, 2 and other biblical passages. The Hebrew word used there is tiham, which describes chaotic, watery depths associated with judgment and spiritual imprisonment. In Revelation 20 verses 1 to 3, for example, the abyss, related to tiham, is mentioned as the place where Satan will be bound for 1,000 years. This suggests that the deep is not merely a geographical space but a dimension linked to divine punishment. When Genesis says that darkness was over the face of the deep, it is not just a poetic detail, it is a clue that the planet was covered by a dark and judged presence. With this in mind, we can imagine the earth not as a place being created out of nothing, but as a post-battle scenario, a devastated planet, suffocated by a dense atmosphere without light, immersed in judgment. This aligns with the narrative of the fall of Lucifer and the angels who followed him, cast out of heaven and confined to lower regions. Jude 1:6 affirms that there are angels who did not keep their positions of authority but abandoned their proper dwelling, and are kept in eternal chains in darkness. Could it be that part of this imprisonment took place precisely in that deep over which darkness reigned? Everything points to yes. This line of reasoning leads us to an intriguing conclusion. The earth described in Genesis 1 verse 2 is not a blank slate but a place of judgment, a cosmic battlefield, a planet marked by the fall of powerful beings, destroyed by an act of divine justice. And that would now be rebuilt, not to continue what was lost, but to begin something entirely new. The creation of man would then come as a new beginning, a new lineage. A new story with distinct purposes. When God said, "Let us make man in our image," he was not only creating but declaring a new spiritual order over a world that had been corrupted. This interpretation does not diminish the value of the creation described in Genesis, on the contrary, it expands it. It reveals that God's plan is greater than we can comprehend from a superficial reading. It reveals that before us, there were celestial stories written with both light and shadow. That angels rebelled, worlds were judged, and the earth was shrouded in darkness until God's voice said, "Let there be light." That light was not merely physical, it was spiritual. It was a declaration of authority, power, and mercy. And most impressively, even after all that, God still chose this planet to begin his story with us. This new beginning that God establishes on earth is laden with symbolism. Every creative act, separating the waters, forming the light, the emergence of life, is an act of restoration. A divine response to the chaos that had set in. God is not only organizing physical elements but also reaffirming his sovereignty over everything that had been shaken before. It is as if day after day he were declaring, disorder does not have the final word. Every detail of creation, from this perspective, becomes a testimony that God's plan is capable of rebuilding even what seems lost forever. But this process of restoration does not occur in a vacuum. The presence of evil does not disappear with the creation of man. On the contrary, it manifests again in the garden through the serpent. This shows that the enemy was not eliminated in the previous judgment but limited, confined, and that his influence still lingered over the new creation. This reinforces the idea that the story of Genesis is not just about origins but about spiritual conflict. Man was created in a battleground, and the setting that seemed like paradise, Eden, was in fact the beginning of a resistance against an evil that had existed for ages. This vision also casts new light on the role of man in creation. We were not placed here merely to cultivate or populate the earth, we were inserted into an already ongoing spiritual context. We are part of a plan that seeks to restore divine order amid chaos. God creates us in his image, gives us authority, and positions us as his representatives in a world marked by spiritual warfare. When we understand this, we realize that our choices, attitudes, and faith are not insignificant. They participate in a story that began long before us and involves dimensions that our eyes do not see, yet are real. And that is why the study of Genesis 1:2 goes far beyond theological curiosity. It connects us with the beginning of the battle between light and darkness. It shows us that the universe we inhabit has already experienced events of great magnitude and that it still bears the marks of that ancient war today. Every spiritual earthquake, every darkness overcome by light, every new beginning that God allows in our lives echoes this pattern. Chaos never triumphs where God chooses to act. If he transformed a destroyed planet into a world full of life, imagine what he can do in your personal story. Nothing is truly lost when God decides to begin again. There is also one element often overlooked in this discussion, the Bible's intentional silence about the details of this interval. This does not mean an absence of information, but rather an invitation to seek. God, in his wisdom, left clues scattered throughout different books such as Job, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jude, and Revelation. These fragments, when gathered, form a surprising picture of what may have happened before the creation of Adam. It is as if the Holy Spirit wished that those who are truly hungry would go beyond the surface and seek to understand the secrets hidden since the foundation of the world. The revelation is not absent, it is encoded. For example, in 2 Peter 3 verses 5 to 7, we find a reference to an ancient world that perished by water. Many interpret this passage as an allusion to Noah's flood, but there are scholars who see in it a parallel with the judgment prior to Genesis 1 verse 3. The text speaks of heavens that existed long ago, and of an earth, formed out of water and through water, which was later destroyed. This raises a question. Was Peter referring to a catastrophe prior to Noah's flood? Was he citing a divine judgment that fits exactly between Genesis 1 verse 1 and 1:2? If so, it would be yet another important piece of this spiritual puzzle. Jude, the brother of James, also mentions angels who abandoned their original state and were cast into darkness, reserved for judgment. This description fits perfectly with the idea of a rebellion prior to the creation of man. These beings are not simply angels who sinned during human history. They are entities that participated in a transgression much older and more severe. The punishment, according to the text, has already been applied, and they are confined in eternal chains. This means that there are spiritual beings imprisoned from before the beginning of human civilization. And this fact further strengthens the theory that something very serious happened before the story of Adam and Eve. This understanding opens up a new horizon regarding humanity's role in the eternal plan. God did not create man merely to inhabit the earth, He created man to represent justice, obedience, and the divine image in a world that had already witnessed a fall. Humanity is like a living response to that previous rebellion. We are a declaration that creation can indeed live in covenant with the Creator, even after the failure of those who came before. This view shifts the focus of the book of Genesis from a simple physical origin to an epic narrative of spiritual redemption. We are here to occupy a place that was once corrupted and to make a difference. This redemptive purpose of humanity also explains the intense spiritual opposition we have faced since Eden. The serpent does not appear by chance, it does not tempt man on a whim. There is a greater reason. Adam and Eve were created to reign over an earth that had already been a stage for rebellion. And that unsettles those who once had dominion here. The temptation is not merely a test, it is a direct attack on a divine project that seeks to restore creation through humankind. The enemy knows this, and that is why he tries to corrupt the plan from the very beginning. Understanding the pre-Adamic past helps us comprehend why the spiritual battle is still so intense today. But there is something even deeper in this context. When God created man, He did not simply form him from dust, He breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. This act set man apart from any being created before. Man came to carry within him something directly connected to the Creator. This had never happened before, not even with celestial beings. That breath represented an intimate and unique connection with God. If angels were created to serve, man was created to relate. And that arouses jealousy, rivalry, and spiritual opposition. The new creation not only occupies a space, it carries a divine identity. This scenario also helps us understand why the plan of redemption was formulated before the foundation of the world. As it is written in Revelation 13 verse 8, God knew what had happened before. He knew the potential for a fall and yet decided to create man with free will. Why? Because true love is not imposed. It is offered. And by giving man the power to choose, God was showing that His plan was not only to restore what was destroyed but to overcome the fall with love and voluntary obedience. This reveals a God who does not merely start over, but starts over with purpose, depth, and hope. All of this leads us to a powerful conclusion. The Bible does not begin with a simple, once upon a time, but with a scenario of war, reconstruction, and mission. Eden is a sacred territory, yes, but it is also a base of spiritual operations. Man was placed there not only as a cultivator, he was given a priestly, spiritual, and strategic role. And when he failed, it was the second great collapse of creation. But God already had a plan. And He did not give up. The story of the Bible, therefore, is not about a creation that went wrong, but but about a creator who insists on restoring, always. Thus, the fall of man was not an unexpected accident but part of a much broader reality that includes free choices, spiritual battles, and cycles of rebellion and restoration. When Adam and Eve sin, God is not surprised. He had already prepared the way for redemption. Genesis 3 verse 15 is the first messianic prophecy, promising that the offspring of the woman would crush the serpent's head. This announcement is not only about the future, it is a reminder that evil will not have the final word. Moreover, it shows that God had already decided to bring a Redeemer long before the foundation of the world and any fall. This Redeemer, Jesus Christ, is described as the Lamb who was slain before even the creation. This means that the plan of the cross existed before Eden, before Adam, before the earth was filled again with life. This makes us ask, if God had everything planned out, why did he continue with creation? Because he wanted to fully reveal his love, not only to men but to the entire universe. Ephesians 3:10 says that through the church, the manifold wisdom of God would be made known even to the principalities and powers in the heavenly realms. In other words, the plan of redemption is a message for all worlds, not just ours. And perhaps this is the greatest revelation hidden between Genesis 1 verse 1 and 1:2. The silence there is not empty. It is laden with history, a history that begins with a glorious creation, passes through a tragic rebellion, and ends with a hopeful new beginning, a history that speaks of angels, of falls, of judgment, but also of light, redemption, and purpose. What seemed to be just an interval of verses may, in fact, contain an entire era lost to human eyes but recorded in celestial memory. And perhaps one day, God will reveal to us everything that happened in that hidden chapter of existence. For now, what we have are clues. But they are enough clues to see that the creation of Adam was not the absolute starting point but rather a continuation of God's plan, a response to chaos, a light in the darkness. A new chance for the earth and its inhabitants. This changes our perspective. We are not merely creatures on just any planet, we are part of a masterpiece in reconstruction. We are called to live righteously in a world that has already been profaned. We are part of the eternal plan of a God who transforms ruins into redemption. And believe this: nothing about this is by chance. There is a reason you are alive right now. If there is one thing this theory teaches us, it is that God does not abandon what he created. Even after the rebellion in heaven, even after the fall of powerful angels, he decided to restore the earth. And even after the fall of man, he did not give up. This shows us a pattern. Where sin abounds, grace abounds even more. Where there is destruction, God offers reconstruction. Where there was darkness, he says, "Let there be light." This is not merely an ancient account. It is the portrait of God's heart, a creator who never gives up on his works, even when they seem irreparably corrupted. And that includes you. But to understand all of this, one must go beyond the surface. The Bible is a living work, full of layers. Those who read it only as a historical record miss the details that point to something much greater. Genesis is not just an account of the world's origin, it is the beginning of a spiritual war, of a cosmic mission, and of an eternal plan. It is a dense, profound, and mysterious introduction of a God who acts both within and outside of time, a God who writes stories with light and shadow, with falls and redemption, with silence and revelation. And it is up to us to seek that wisdom with awe and reverence. That is why so many mysteries remain hidden, not because God maliciously conceals them, but because he desires that his children seek him. Proverbs 25 verse 2 says, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, to search out a matter is the glory of kings." There is honor in seeking. There is purpose in questioning. When you delve into Genesis and begin to see beyond the obvious, you participate in a spiritual journey, a holy investigation. And perhaps as you advance, You realize that many answers are not found in books or traditions but in an intimate relationship with the Holy Spirit, who guides us into all truth. Thus, the silence between Genesis 1 verse 1 and 1:2 should not be feared or ignored. It should be studied, explored, discerned, because it carries lessons that can transform our faith. It shows us that we are not the first to fail, but we can be the first to overcome. It reveals that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against ancient forces that once challenged heaven. It reminds us that even in the face of chaos, God is capable of restoring everything, including your life, your family, your calling. The same God who said, "Let there be light," over a devastated world still says it over wounded hearts today. And perhaps this is one of the greatest messages hidden at the beginning of the Bible: God is a restorer par excellence. He transforms destruction into purpose, ruin into beauty, darkness into light. The creation of man was not a mistake, it was a response, a declaration that God's love is not intimidated by the fall. That He is capable of beginning anew as many times as necessary until His will is accomplished. This inspires us to view our own story with new eyes. Perhaps you are also going through your own Genesis 1 verse 2 in life, formless, empty, dark. But God is still saying, "Let there be light." And when He speaks, everything changes. The light appears. Order is restored. The Spirit hovers over the chaos and initiates something new. That is how God acts. He does not need ideal conditions to begin, He creates the conditions. He does not wait for everything to be perfect to act, He acts in the midst of despair. It was so with the earth, so with humanity, and so with each one of us. The same God who restored an entire planet can also restore a broken heart. The silence between two verses may contain a story of pain, but it can also contain the beginning of a journey of redemption. The question then is not just what was on earth before Genesis 1 verse 2, but rather, what is within us now? Is there chaos? Is there darkness? Is there a past that seems irrecoverable? Know this: that does not frighten the Creator. He has already dealt with heavenly rebellions, with destroyed worlds, with corrupted systems. And yet He decided to continue. He decided to rebuild. He can do the same with you. What the gap theory reveals to us, more than ancient details, is an eternal message. God restores what has been broken, and He does so gloriously. And when we look at the world today, full of conflicts, confusion, and spiritual imbalance, we realize that the same pattern continues. The earth of Genesis 1 verse 2 still echoes in our time. The good news? The God of Genesis 1 verse 3 is still saying, "Let there be light." He continues to intervene, rebuild, and heal. And one day, just as He restored the earth in the beginning, He will completely restore all things. There will be new heavens and a new earth, a new Eden, no darkness, no falls, no interruptions. Until then, our mission is to remain steadfast in the light, even when the world around us seems formless and empty. You are not here by accident. The same God who decided to restore the earth could have abandoned it. But He did not do so. He saw value in starting over. And if He saw value in a planet covered in darkness, imagine how much He values you. Perhaps you too are in a moment of silence between chaos and reconstruction. Perhaps you are in your own verse 2. But the story does not end there. God's voice still echoes. There is still light to be released. There is still a plan in motion, and you are a part of it. Your existence is a divine response to the chaos of the past. So rise up. No matter how dark your situation may be, the Creator is still a specialist in transforming darkness into testimony. He has done it before, with the earth, with the heavens, with the history of humanity. And He will do it again in your life. The silence between the verses is just the pause before the light, the interval before the miracle. And when God decides to act, nothing remains the same. May this revelation awaken in you faith, courage, and hope. Because the same God who said, "Let there be light," over a destroyed world is the same one who today whispers to your heart, "Begin again." Thank you for getting here. If this message touched your heart, don't keep this truth to yourself. Share this video, comment on what you learned, and subscribe to continue exploring the wonders of the kingdom of God together. May the Lord bless you, strengthen you, and help you lift your gaze each day, because the heavens are still speaking, and God continues to reign.